Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Professional Webinar Series. We'll get started in 1 minute. Let's just let people come into the room. And then we'll get started. We've got a great presentation today. It looks like quite a few are still coming in. All right, well, let's get started. Good morning, I'm Jen Marvin. I am the Education Coordinator here at the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. I'd like to welcome you to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Professional Webinar Series. Today's webinar is Public Perception of Sustainable Landscaping Practices with Dr. Jiayang Li. Your microphones will be muted. We will be closing the chat feature during the presentation. Please put any questions that you have during the presentation into the Q&A box, not the chat box, and we will take them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is approved for one FFLCP, LIAF, FDACs, including LCLM, LLO, and CLO, DBPR, which is LAs and CAMs, FNGLA, and one AICP CEU. It's a lot of letters. There's a $15 administration fee to receive the certificate this morning for continuing education. As soon as we get started, I'll put the link in the chat box so you can make payment for the certificate if you have not already done so. We will submit the CEUs to the licensing agencies if you are not a self-reporter on Friday. So make sure to make the payment by the end of the day today. This is part of a monthly webinar series held on Tuesdays of each month at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. However, our next webinar will be on November 4th due to the Veterans Day holiday. So we will be 1 week earlier than we normally are. Our next webinar is Creating Habitat Connectivity with Urban Landscape, and it is Isabella Gattuso Brown, also from UF. Please note that, I just said that the webinar is in the first week of November, not November 11th. You will see a survey invitation pop up. Please take a moment to fill this out as it really helps us determine what educational programs to offer and what you're interested in. Right now, I'm in the process of creating the 2026 FFL Professional Webinar Series. If you'd like to see anything specific, a specific topic, a presenter maybe, please email me directly or leave a comment on the survey, and I will be going through those. And I will also put my email in the chat as soon as we get started here. So without any further delay, I'll turn the floor over to Tom Wickman to introduce today's presenter.
Thank you so much, Jen. And welcome to our monthly professional webinar series. It's always great to see so many folks. This is a series that we've been running for the past 5 years or so and has been really successful, and I'm really excited so many of you can join us each and every month. I'm excited to be able to introduce today's speaker is Dr. Jiayang Li is an interdisciplinary scholar working at the intersection of landscape architecture and climate change adaptation. With a keen interest in everyday landscape experiences and human perceptions of ecological landscape design, her research focuses on the human dimension of ecological design with the goal of informing people about nature-based solutions that enhance climate resilience and adaptation while creating enjoyable outdoor environments in local communities. She's been published in multiple top-ranked journals such as Landscape and Urban Planning, Urban Forestry and Urban Greening, and Ecology and Society, and given guest lectures and conference presentations nationally and internationally. Dr. Li earned her PhD in Environment and Sustainability and a Master's of Landscape Architecture from the University of Michigan. She also holds a Bachelor of Engineering in Landscape Architecture from Tongji University in Shanghai, China. Before turning her primary focus to research, she had practiced in firms including Smith Group and AECOM. It's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Dr. Li as she presents Public Perceptions of Sustainable Landscape Practices. Take it away, Dr. Li.
Thank you so much, Tom, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today. You already see the topic of my talk today. So as I'm preparing for this talk, I was like, how can I pull together many years of thinking and work around this topic? And then I decided rather than focusing on one or two specific research projects, I really want to draw on my research and mentoring experience over the years to invite you to think with me about three questions. What is perception? Why does it matter? And how can we design more sustainable landscapes with these understandings in mind? So before I go further, I want to clarify that my research doesn't focus on landscaping practices in the traditional sense, the kind that many of you may work with every day. So instead, I look at nature-based solutions, or NBS. It's a fairly new umbrella term describing actions that are inspired by, supported by, or modeled after nature to address society challenges. You can think of it as a more like overlapping closely with terms like green infrastructure or green stormwater infrastructure, which may sound more familiar if that's the case. So NBS practices can be designed at many different scales and for a wide range of purposes, from managing stormwater to enhancing coastal resiliency to creating urban forests and restoring ecosystems. Many of you are experts in the more specific practices that fit under the broader concept of NBS. Here we are looking at the 9 principles of Florida friendly landscaping, things like native planting, water management, and how can we manage our landscapes to be more sustainable and help achieve a Florida-friendly landscaping. But no matter what terms we use, what environmental issues we focus on, I believe we share a common goal here. That is to encourage wider adoption of sustainable practices in homes and communities, practices that can protect land, water, wildlife, and the overall human well-being. But I think many of you may have a similar concern as I do, is that this is not happening fast enough because the general public often have very different perceptions of what sustainable landscape practices are. And these perceptions are largely shaped by how the landscapes look, their aesthetics, which more often than not isn't exactly attractive. So as I was searching for some images to use for this talk today, I came across this very interesting Reddit posting. I think it's a very revealing example. So here, the original poster was very excited to share a yard project for adding Florida native plants at a corner of the home, and even included some photos to show the process. So, a few like-minded native plant enthusiasts jumped in to praise and encourage this effort. But the rest of the comments were a mix of thoughts, hesitation, and questions. And look at this reaction of, I want to get started with some natives, but I'm just so overwhelmed. So that feeling is very classic, isn't it? I'm sure many of you already recognize how important it is to consider public perception, and especially the aesthetics of plants of the project. So for example, if you land on the Florida Friendly Landscaping page for home landscapes, beauty is clearly used as a key draw for promoting sustainable practices. And it's a really effective strategy. In fact, many studies evaluating nature-based solutions have found that aesthetic value and recreational opportunities are often the most, if not the only, ecosystem services recognized by the public. But I would like to raise a question. Should we care about aesthetics and perceptions only because it helps to sell sustainable landscapes? So to unpack that question, I want to introduce you to this model that I found myself returning to again and again over the years, a model of human-environment interactions in the landscape developed by Gobster and colleagues. So this model has really helped me think about what we see in a place shapes how we feel about it, and ultimately how we would act toward it. And I have shared it with many people who are interested in sustainable and ecological design because it offers such a useful way to understand perceptions and aesthetics. So this model highlights, first, it highlights what the authors call the perceptible realm, where people can easily make sense of environmental phenomena through their senses. Because as humans, we can only perceive landscape at a human scale, and we cannot directly see, for example, how stormwater moves through a neighborhood's terrain or how soils affect plant health. Because we can only perceive landscape at a human scale, it is impossible to grasp this less visible process that is usually happen either on a very big scale or on a very micro scale. In other words, environmental processes and ecological functions do not speak for themselves like landscapes patterns do. So for example, in a typical Florida yard, the green lawn makes a landscape pattern that everyone can immediately recognize. But what is less visible or perceivable is some other issues that we are all care about. What is the implication for soil health? What about pollinator support? How about herbicides that used to try to keep this really large and green landscape, but that can pollute stormwater runoff? And also the energy cost associated with mowing. And then if we replace the law with native plants, it is this visible change in the landscape patterns, again, that people immediately notice and respond to, not the improvements in environmental benefits, such as better soil health or more pollinators or less polluted runoff. So if we are concerned about environmental problems and we are hoping to get more sustainable practices, then we should all think about our connection to the environment really depends on what people can perceive. And aesthetics becomes this bridge between ecological functions and human experience. Or put it simply, aesthetics is not the icing on the cake, it's the chemistry that makes the cake rise. People often talk about aesthetics as if it's a luxury, something you add after the real work of sustainable design is done. As the design mantra goes, form follows functions. But I would like to argue the opposite. Aesthetics gives the design its shape, its texture, and flavor, what makes people actually want to slice. And this brings the second idea I want to highlight in the human-environment interaction model. So aesthetics is not just about appearance or style of a landscape design. It's actually directly connected to our perceptions, our sensory and emotional experience. It is that pleasant feeling we have toward the look and feel of something we like. And such pleasant feeling is not only meaningful for our sense of well-being, but can also drive behaviors that affect landscape and the environment, for better or for worse. So now, while we cannot yet still fully map aesthetic experience to our brain activity, I'll explain all the science behind how it forms. We do know that people's aesthetic preferences in landscapes are not random. And that brings us to another big question. So why do people like what they like about a landscape? Or maybe even more importantly, why do they not like what we want what we think they should like or what we want them to like? So decades of research and a lot of our everyday experience tell us that our landscape perception and aesthetic preferences tend to grow from three major sources. The first is the biological and evolutionary roots. And the second is the cultural traditions and social norms that we are taught to see a landscape as tidy, beautiful, and natural, for example. And then the third aspect to think about is some personal experience and values, our memories, and even personality traits that color how we respond to landscapes. So by gaining a deeper understanding of these sources, we can develop design strategies that create more preferred and ultimately more widely adopted sustainable landscape patterns. So in the rest of my talk today, I would like to walk you through each of these sources and share a few ideas and projects from my research and mentoring that explore how these layers shape public perception of sustainable landscapes. My work has been really focusing on three types of perception: attractiveness or beauty, safety, and neatness, given how important they are for people's preference and decision making. So let's start with the biological and the evolutionary roots. There are many theories out there regarding this topic, but I want to highlight the information processing theory developed by Rachel and Stephen Kaplan as an example. So the essence of this theory is that as a species, human beings have an innate need to survive, understand, and explore the environment around us. Therefore, we are naturally drawn to landscapes that we can easily make sense of, yet that also invite exploration by offering the promise of new information. Based on this understanding, the Kaplan's proposed a framework, many of you may have seen this before, that has 4 key predictors of preference: coherence, complexity, legibility, and mystery. These qualities balance the needs for safety and curiosity, which are fundamental to human survival and enjoyment of landscape. So in practice, sustainable landscapes tend to be more biodiverse and wilder than those designed primarily for comfort or for amenity. And this often results in higher complexity, which, while ecologically rich, can sometimes disrupt coherence, making the design harder to interpret at first glance. So how can we improve coherence of sustainable landscapes? An effective strategy is to pay close attention to the overall visual structure. So before you think about the specific species you can use, think about how to organize different plants into very clear zones or vertical layers and grouping them in blocks, for example, based on the shared visual characteristics, such as their sizes, colors, or textures. This spring, I advised a master's student, Jacob Bailey, who explored this strategy in depth during his thesis project. So in this project, Jacob addressed the challenge of developing appealing planting design schemes with Florida native plants. Specifically, he started off with 3 archetypes in planting design: forest, savanna, and meadow, then developed layering strategies for each archetype. For example, in this, the forest archetype, he was looking at the 3 layers. The first layer consists of largest shade-casting trees, such as oaks or southern magnolias, which establish the foundational canopy structure. Then in the second layer basically helped to fuse the mid to upper canopy with trees that add height, depth, and contrast, such as longleaf pines, which contribute striking vertical lines with their tall column-like trunks. And the third layer includes smaller, more ornamental trees, such as white frame tree and Florida flame azalea, which help give some seasonal moments of color and bloom. In addition, you can also add in a layer of lush ground cover that spread well and provides seasonal interest to further give a vibrant feeling, where soils and irrigation conditions allow. So next, moving from our evolutionary roots, let's look at how cultural and social influences frames those instincts. So social norms and cultural traditions strongly influence what we perceive as good or beautiful landscapes. Placing environmentally beneficial elements into human-dominated landscapes can be really challenging if the resulting landscape appearance doesn't align with cultural values. To address this challenge, Professor Joe Nassauer framed the concept of cues to care, which are landscape elements that are immediately recognizable as designed, and that signal continuing human presence to care for a landscape. So in this photo you're looking at, you can see how a really, narrow strip of mound edge give you a sense that this landscape is maintained by someone, it's cared by someone, and it's not random but very intentional design. So mound edge is a pretty common example of cues to care. Other elements that people commonly talk about also include fences, signage, and basically any visible signs of care and maintenance. So the idea of cues to care highlights the role of social meaning and maintenance signals in shaping acceptance for ecological design. And it has been widely used in various sustainable practices such as green stormwater management, restoration projects, native planting, etc. So if you haven't encountered this concept before, I recommend checking out this excellent IFAS extension article for light and practical introduction. That said, it's important to use cues to care thoughtfully. And effective application requires more than simply selecting a few design elements from a checklist. In fact, many papers reference cues to care as a set of design features without examining their underlying mechanisms. So if you look at this ray mechanism, and this small footnote is actually from referring to a review paper I co-authored with Professor Nassauer back in 2022, and where we clarified this three key mechanisms that make cues to care work. The first is they have to be easily recognizable. Immediately, people can notice this element. And then the second mechanism is to communicate of caring human intention or presence. And then the third thing is a consistency with local cultural traditions and social norms for landscape appearance. And in this paper, in addition to clarifying these three underlying mechanisms, we also systematically reviewed 202 papers that cited the foundational works of cues to care. Our goal here was to understand how scholars and practitioners have engaged with the concept and how it continues to evolve as a bridge between ecological function and cultural meaning. And we found many examples of cues to care across diverse contexts, from residential neighborhoods to parks to nature preserves. And there are many more options you can use in addition to mulching and turf. But what is really an interesting finding we found is this lack of discussion or examination about how cues to care, why they work in a specific context. So next, I want to share two studies on green stormwater infrastructure based in US Midwest to explain why we need to employ cues to care more mindfully. So in this first study, it's about bioretention gardens in Detroit. And it was a collaboration between our research team and the Detroit Water and Sewage Department. They, at that time, were trying to develop pilot neighborhood green infrastructure to improve water quality and complying with EPA's code. So this is what it was based on the neighborhood with a lot of vacant property. And then the idea was to identify vacant properties and then demolish houses and clean up the site and use where in Midwest there were basements and then use the basement space to kind of as this natural depression to store storm water, and try to retain up to 300,000 gallons of runoff from the street. So, the design, it works pretty clearly from an engineering perspective, how you divert the water to this retention area. But one question the sewer department has for us is how can we design the landscape above this water storage unit? And so we, informed by the idea of queues to care, we developed several different treatments for design scenarios. So think about, since it is a highly vacant neighborhood, safety is a big concern to the residents living there. So we developed these two scenarios with ballers or no ballers, and then a series of planting design ideas that require no maintenance all the way to more maintenance. And I think one thing we all need to pay attention to is the idea of queues to care links to maintenance. So when you have queues to care, you have to devote maintenance effort to it. So, and we then kind of developed some realistic visualizations to visualize how these different typologies would work in the landscape. And we did a survey throughout the community to understand people's perception. And this is what we got. As you can see from the results, if we're looking at the structural element with ballard, that's much more preferred by residents. And then we also see a trend that the more queues to care with colorful flowers and shrubs is getting more like higher preference among the residents. And particular to this neighborhood, even trees are an element that many people enjoy from the landscape because of the safety issue I just mentioned. People don't really like trees. So that's kind of just one study for us to think about how can we use queues to care more mindfully. And I also want to share another study, which is also a survey-based study, and they surveyed 3 different cities in the Midwest. And the idea was to looking at a stormwater retention pond. But the background of this project is we were testing this new technology where you can use sensors to sense the water level in the retention pond and to kind of drain the water before a big storm hits, so you can free up more storage space. So it's this broader idea of like how smart technology can support stormwater management. And what I want to highlight from this study is, although we often talk about mow or turf edge or mow the lawns around the retention pond really is a more preferred option than shown in the bottom image, unmaintained or spontaneous vegetation. We find the same result basically when the water level is kind of typical. People prefer the mow scenario. However, here's what it gets really interesting. So if you look at the graph here, when the water level is low, or if you can think about it, it's a retention pond that water gets really low at times. The unmaintained scenario was actually much more preferred than the mow scenario, and people think they are more attractive and neat to look at. So just another example to kind of drive home the idea of many nuances behind queues to care and how we need to be mindful about the specific context and community we work with. So moving to the next source to think about, we also have to consider how personal histories and experience influence people's perception, how people have different experience may perceive the exact same design very differently. Here I refer a study that looked at preference for green infrastructure between designers and lay people. And like many other studies have found out, this study noted that among or really among turf or among retention pond was much less preferred by designers compared to the general public. So I want to just use this example to highlight that you are all experts from environmental design or environmental science related fields. And one thing to keep in mind is that this very intensive disciplinary experience and backgrounds have already shaped your perception greatly. And that many other people who don't have such training or professional experience, they don't have the knowledge you do. And therefore, they tend to perceive the landscape differently from you. So just something to keep in mind. And then I also want to share another studies here that talk about how experience really affect our perception. So in this study, and it's the same survey from the Midwest Stormwater Management, where we also looked at innovative design, which we called floodable sites. And this idea is basically to try to use a recreational site, like the image we're showing here, like a basketball court. How can we redesign it so it perform multiple functions? In a sunny day weather, it can just be used for recreational uses. But then during a storm and shortly after a storm, it can temporarily hold runoff to help relieve the pressure to some water infrastructures. So it's an idea that it's a very appealing idea that how we can use the same site to accommodate different functions in different situations. So, but trying to see what's the public perception of this practice like, we did from the survey, we also compared this floodables idea to a more conventional retention pond where, how about if we store more water in it? And then you kind of like seeing a flooding-like situation. And here's is what we found. So, even though in the dry condition or like non-storm condition, the floodable sites were perceived as safer than the retention ponds, they were perceived as less safe under the storm conditions where water is temporarily held. And what is more interesting from the study is actually we looked at people experience of localized flooding, and that's by two factors. First is the frequency of noticing flooding or standing water near one's home, and then the second factor is whether the particular participant were surveyed from a high flood hazard area. And what we found is actually the experience, the more experience you have with localized flooding was associated with the lower lower perceived safety of floodable sites. So, people who have more experience with localized flooding, they might, mistake this scenario as a flooded site and therefore have a less preference and think it's dangerous. And transitioning to another study, we recently finished in Cedar Key, which looks at a living shoreline practice where we did an intercept survey in Cedar Key, and we try to understand the residents and visitors' perception about 5 types of shoreline interventions across the green to gray spectrum. So on the green spectrum, very far end, you have the living shorelines using only vegetations, and then sills, which combines vegetation and some structural elements like rocks, and then beach nourishment. There's no structural elements, natural or man-made, and then more typical hardened practices. So what is really interesting from this survey is we see a quite different result from what we know about existing literature perception of living shorelines. And that's mainly about the safety side. So if you look at this graph, this bar kind of like indicate the significant statistical analysis. And easy way to rate this, if you look at the letters up above here, so what is labeled with A and B group, that's basically saying our group A, they don't have a statistical significant difference, but group D is statistically lower than the 4 types of practices in terms of the perceived protection function of the shoreline. And as you can see here, the green or more natural solutions is perceived no different than the hardened practices in terms of their protection function, which is a really different finding than the existing literature. Whereas beauty, what we see beauty here, the green options are perceived as more beautiful than the hardened structure, and which is consistent with many existing studies about homeowners and how they manage their shorelines. Usually people will think nature-based solutions are really great. They are more beautiful. They support the environment better, but they do not offer enough protection function at the shoreline. And while we show a pretty different results that in Cedar Key, this particular community, the living shorelines were perceived as both beautiful and protective. So after we get the results, we kind of reflect on why this is the case. And so one thing, go back to the, one thing we noticed from the sample is on average, the participants in the survey, they are relatively pro-environmental people. So the scale used to measure people's environmental attitude show a pretty high above average score for this group. But another thing that our team think is more important to for this results is there have been living shoreline pilot projects going on in Cedar Key for almost 2 decades, and almost a decade for now, and through Florida Sea Grant. So there was a series of demonstration of living shoreline, and also the city has changed their code to promote living shoreline and restrict the construction of hardened structure like bulkhead and seawalls. So for this particular community, this experience or exposure to living shoreline might have changed their perception about the practice dramatically. Another finding about from this study is we also look at different users of the shoreline and how likely they will contribute to the funding for coastal structure, as well as how willing they are to help with the everyday maintenance and management of these practices. And what we found, one group really stand out with very high willingness to contribute to both finding and maintenance is the shore-based anglers. And interestingly, we didn't see the same trend for boat-based anglers. So again, one explanation we have is the recreational activities and experience really change people's perception of the shoreline and the practices to protect the shoreline. And then even just this place-based where you are, whether you are using the shoreline during your recreation activities might have an impact. Yeah, so this kind of conclude my ideas about these 3 different sources and some research I have done over the year. If you still remember my opening slide, this is a photo of the High Line in New York City before the project High Line was implemented. And I kind of want to invite you to pause here and think about why this really spontaneous urban green space as it was before. It wasn't used by the community. It's not something people celebrated and want to visit. But if you are looking at it from a more ecological and environmental perspective, it's a very self-sustaining landscape. It doesn't require irrigation or weeding or anything. And it definitely provides many services to the city, even nobody is using this. But then this is what the Highline looks like today. And some sections of the project still maintain really just spontaneous like it was before. But the majority of the section has been greatly transformed. And even the planting palette features a relatively natural and wild looking style because there's so many structural elements added to it, and all the maintenance people devote to make it looking cared for and attractive. It attracts millions of people to visit it today. So with that, I kind of want to just highlight again the concluding takeaways. If you remember three things from the talk today, the first is environmental benefits and the ecological functions do not speak for themselves in the perceptible realm. And then the second idea is aesthetics is not icing on a cake. It's the chemistry that make the cake rise. It's what people relate, how people relate to the landscape, especially if they don't have a strong background in environmental knowledge. And then the third is some design strategies for how can they work with public perception, improve public perception of sustainable practices from the three sources, both biological, cultural, and personal. And then that's to try to balance the complexity and coherence through visual structures, and then employ cues to care, but with thoughtfulness and caution. And then the third is to know people who we are designing for, not just for their aesthetics preference, but also their past experience with the landscape. Yeah, so with that, I would like to conclude the talk. We still have plenty of time. And one thing I have in mind for today's talk is I really want to embrace this as an opportunity for discussion. So if you have any questions or thoughts, I would love to hear them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Li. That was really inspiring and very different look on how we sometimes think about landscapes. And you know, I love the thought of aesthetics being more than just the icing on the cake. That is that's really profound. So I loved your insights. We do have a couple of questions. One of them is, would you suggest adding flowering plants in a living shoreline or a littoral zone to improve people's enjoyment as well as absorbing pollutants?
Yes, so my answer is yes to start with. I think for the pollutant part, we'll have to, I'm not like an expert on that, and we may be able to select species really intentionally to do that. But I think in general, adding flowers is a great idea. So here's the reason. Again, I can link to the biological source at first. So because flowers really represent a resource, you know, flowers and fruits, they usually indicate like a landscape. If we think back, you know, millions years ago when our ancestors were exploring the landscape, you see a patch of flowers that usually indicate good resource. You can for food, for water. So that's something, you know, people are naturally drawn to colorful flowers. And also indeed in the cues to care, more from the social side. That's also important cues to care. So if you look at this, let me go back to the Detroit study, where we include, this is the final design we land on. And, you know, this scenario of shrubs and flowers were perceived most attractive, safe, and neat among all these scenarios. So again, evidence that flowers are really important. And I just want to add a little bit more. In another study, a subsequent study for the same project, our team looked also at the mental health benefits, like people's self-reported mental health points. And then we found actually people who reported lower mental health scores by themselves actually perceived the flowers even as more attractive. So they have even higher preference. So I think that's another thing to think about. It's just from one study, but I think it's something interesting to share. And here is a caution on that. Again, they will require probably more maintenance. And so that's something to keep in mind. We cannot assume the self-sustaining landscape will look fantastic. You really will have to maintain them, if not for ecological functions and performance, it's also for people's perception and how the attractiveness of the landscape and how people will continue to like it and support it. Yeah. So hopefully that answers the question. Yes to flowers.
Very good. Would you also suggest plants that are hosts for butterflies and that other wildlife like birds to increase the enjoyment by people?
Yeah, so I think that's for sure we want to include pollinators plants a lot. And I was once the Dr. Daniel Jarrett, who is the director of the Historic Museum of Florida and an expert on pollinator plants, he did a guest lecture in our class, and he actually studied this, what works well for pollinators. And one thing that align with what I just talked about, this idea of big, the visual structures. You want to have larger blocks of plants or groups of plants that people can easily recognize. And that's actually work well for pollinator species as well, because they will get more benefit from a landscape that is more balanced. So you want to balance not only the number of plants, but also the amount of them. So I think one thing we need to keep in mind about the pollinator plants is sometimes we'll see pollinator gardens. It has like so many different species in a very small area. So if you're working at a smaller scale site, it's even more important to be careful. Don't put tons of different plants. Or you can think about, okay, I want the color palette to be, let's say, purple and yellow to provide a really interesting contrast. And then the task is to find different species if you want to really add different types of plants. To what are some species I can use that are have yellow flowers, that have purple flowers, and try to group them together. So at least visually, it's much easier to make sense of. And another thing is like, it really depends on if you're working with a private, on a private property with a client. First thing is to see whether they like pollinators or not, because that's something people can drive people away. I know like some parents are really concerned about pollinators, like bees sting their kids, things like that. And that's bring another point. I didn't really talk about environmental education in my talk today. And that is not to say they are not important. What I really focus on the landscape patterns and aesthetics, because that's what or way as designers can change. So again, those on the topic of pollinators, I think the public education outreach will be really important to kind of change that perspective about safety. Like they are not safe to have in the landscape. Yeah.
Great points, Dr. Li. Our good friend Deirdre asks, do you have any tips on gaining acceptance of smaller areas of turf to residential landscapes?
Yes, so some practical terms, it's going to be always case by case, but I think if you are working on a property that has like zero is all turf. So good strategy is to start small. So try to instead of like try to replace the whole landscape, you want to at least keep maybe a third or 2/3 of the landscape still as turf. So just if that person or like the community already have a strong opinion of we want a lawn, we want a turf, the always good to start small in terms of the area of like native plants or non-turf plants. And another thing is to, again, maintain a really crisp edge. So maybe you can create some really interesting edge or form along the line, and also adding some edging material. Again, back to this idea of like some structural elements that people can immediately recognize, okay, this is my native or wild patch. This is the turf zone where we can play, where we can use. So that idea of like, if you don't break the turf into smaller patches, but kind of like keep a larger, just one zone of turf, one zone of native plants, but you can change the shape, the form of the planted area and think about the edge, how to make it more clear, and also think about maintenance. Yeah.
Okay, very cool. Donna down south asks, do you think that public perception on attractive landscaping is changing towards more wild, and sustainable paradigms?
I think I will say positive. Hopefully, it is changing, and I think it's. I mean, I don't have research data on this or evidence on this, but I think in general, yes, and especially because I teach a lot of younger generation students. At least in my class, there are so many students who are very concerned and care deeply about native plants, and they want to explore how to adopt them more. Like Jacob's example, we have students who are like devoted a lot of effort to this idea, and with the recognition of public perception is really important. So hopefully the tide is changing, is turning, even like slowly. So again, that's why I feel I believe the making these practices appealing and something community and homeowners want will be really important, because the more adoption there are, people will have a more positive experience of them, like the living shoreline Cedar Key. I think in addition to the fact that it's a very environmental aware community, it's also those demonstration projects that they can witness in their everyday life, and they see how it fit in the community, and that change people's perception. Yeah.
Okay. How do ethnobotanical uses for plants fit into cues?
That's a good question. So one thing, I know I may be saying something really wild here, and I totally get it if you have like a strong opinion against this. But from a design point, I would encourage you to think less about, the purpose of a plant, its ethnobotanical significance or ecological significance. You can have all those ideas in mind, but when you come to how I arrange those plants together, again, it's back to the visual structure, the textures, the characteristics. How can you use that to draw people's attention? Again, you can always have a sign in the landscape to educate people about the importance of these plants. But I think just for the general public, people who do not have maybe a strong interest in this, you wanted them to be able to notice and to like the landscape first before they can dive in to know more about, this is a plant with really significant cultural meaning or anthropobotanical meaning. So and I'm not a big fan for some botanical garden walk where you like organize the plants just by the name, the letter, their name's letter, or like the different regions, again, in a very botanical setting, that makes sense and people expect that. But it's probably not going to be a successful strategy in a public park. Yeah.
Okay, great. Chrissy states that she thinks residents in suburbs tend to not want to take care of an intensive landscape, but rather pay somebody once a week to come in and mow and blow. She says, have you done any studies on public acceptance of a more vegetated yard in Florida specifically?
So not yet. As a little bit background, I only joined UF in 2022. So the projects I've been working on hasn't really kind of focused on that aspect. But I think there are many researchers at IFAS are looking at that. How can you help to improve like consumers' preference for plants and yeah, just in general, like some strategies to help. But that's a really great point. And again, I think we need to all accept the reality that native or very ecological landscape, they still requires a lot of care. They can self-sustain, again, by ecological terms, but not self-sustain just to feed people's expectation of how they would look. And it will, and from my experience working with colleagues and talking with colleagues from IFAS, it's really hard. Even people who work a lot on planting design for many years, they still struggle with upkeeping a native plant. It's just we lack experience and knowledge of how to easily maintain them, and all of that. So I know there have been many efforts going on at IFAS are trying to push this how to take care of native landscapes to the green industry. But I think generally it's just a really hard challenge. Like a landscape will require us to take care of, like,
Yeah.
Pretty much everything in life. Like you want it to look good, perform properly, we have to take care of that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's
And
no such thing as a no maintenance landscape.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So one thing I'm kind of testing in my own teaching is actually to develop some maintenance guidebook. So I have been tasking students, I teach planting design, by the way, in our department. And I've been co-taught with Dr. Gail Hansen, who is a professor in the environmental horticulture department. And we take on projects that have a focus on native plants almost every semester. And I have been asking the students to develop this like landscape care booklet, in a way that is organized by, for example, like the schedule. You're looking at a calendar and you have this general idea, I have these plants I need to take care of, what do I need to do during different seasons. So I think from a designer's perspective, the communication is one approach we can make the maintenance need more accessible. So it's not really, people are not going to look at 10-page tasks explaining how to take care of the landscape. So develop some graphic material that more easily to grasp and really, beginner friendly. I think that's something we can all do in the effort to improve adoption and make it less overwhelming.
I think that's really a profound thought, and we need to try and take the mystery and the intimidation of maintaining this landscape out, because it's really not that difficult once you look at it and get some experience. But if you don't know what you don't know, it can be very intimidating.
Yeah. So I hope I have included one example of that, but I don't in the slide. Yeah, so it's I probably have some here. No, I cannot really easily find them. So yeah, but it's kind of a really simple booklet. people can just look at and understand, even they don't know the plans.
Yeah,
It's
very
kind of
nice.
like mapped by a yard design of like, this is the pink zone. The pink zone has this type of plant, and this is what you need to do. Yeah.
Hmm. Another question, are you aware of any instances where HOAs or local governments have incorporated or codified cues to care into their ordinances and or design requirements? Um,
So, oh,
Go ahead.
okay. That's a great question. And I don't know about HOA or government codes, but I think many designers are kind of at least aware or start to use this concept. And for a lot of landscape architects, I think this idea of like the visual structure is something really essential to the design training. So I think that part is kind of taken care of. But then the cues to care is more about like the maintenance, the selection of species, how to organize them, things like that. Yeah, I don't think like I haven't done any research on this, but I know just like from talking with folks like practitioners, for example, Dix Hyde, a firm in Florida, I know they know about the concept and they are kind of use it in a maybe more off the record. One thing designers should do more is to write about how the design intentions are. But usually when you see a project, like I think some of those ideas are kind of integrated into the design proposals. But no, I don't know about HOA or
Okay.
government codes. And I think that's a really great thing we
There's a
should
lot of
push
avenues,
for.
a lot we can still learn
Yeah.
on how our designs and things are affect people's attitudes.
Yeah.
Uh, Carol says that she noted that the age distribution of respondents in your Cedar Key project was skewed to represent mainly older population. She was saying perhaps a sister study to show the attitudes of a higher level of younger population would be interesting to see. Um,
Yeah, that's a great point. And one thing about the Cedar Keep community is if you look at the American communities survey, it's not too different because it's average pretty old, like many retirees and older population. So that's kind of like the makeup of the community. But I definitely agree with the note on younger generation. So I, from some literature, the good news is, on general, I think there's a trend that young people are they're more concerned about like climate problems and how can we solve them. So I think that's something I know about from the literature. Yeah, but
okay.
you are definitely right. We can do more study focus on young people. Yeah,
Very good. And the last question I have for you, you've been so patient. Thank you so much for taking all these questions. But
of
have
course.
you come across research or resources that would help characterize a client's native landscaping design to an HOA's architectural review board? And are they becoming more accepted by those review boards and those communities?
So no. Short answer is no. I don't really know about any resources. But I think maybe a good starting point is IFAS, the extension publications. Yeah, but I don't really know about that area.
Yeah, he said that he finds that describing the ecological benefits only gets so far, and so that's where putting the whole picture together and trying to show probably some of those other ecosystem services that can be given by a landscape, um, you know, can also probably help folks out.
Yeah, so as I said, that's like really on the point. Like, many research have seen about ecosystem services and perception around them is like aesthetic value and recreational benefits are the most recognizable. So I think the FFL's homepage is a really great example. We are looking at 3 paragraphs here, and you can see like beauty and the look and the aesthetic is something really kind of used as a draw. So I think, again, back to the point, it's not like we don't care about ecological benefits or performance, or we have to, hide them in some way. But it's kind of like when you pitch the idea or the design, think about what relate to people most. And I think this is a good example of like to talk about your designs amenities, how they will add, the appeal to the neighborhood, how they would improve people's quality of life and sense of well-being, because it's really nice to look at, and then it will help maintain the property value, things like that. And you don't have to make people to buy this idea. I will accept a design because it's good for the ecological. It has a lot of ecological benefits, and it can still have all those benefits. It's just we kind of frame how we talk about them. Again, this is the reason why I come to this framework all the time. Think about what people can easily perceive versus what they can't. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Dr. Li, thank you so much. A lot of great information today, some new insights, and hopefully the audience enjoyed it as much as I did. For folks out there, thank you so much for joining us for our October edition of the Professional Webinar Series. Our next webinar is November 4th, as Jen told you earlier. It's normally the second Tuesday. However, that's a holiday next month, so we moved it to the first Tuesday. That's November 4th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, and it's on creating habitat connectivity in the urban landscape. Please remember to complete your survey, and I hope everyone has a great day. Dr. Li, thank you so much once again.
Yeah, thank you all for the listening through this. And if you have any questions, here's my email. If you're interested in the like papers reference, you can reach out to me. I'm happy to provide the links to you all. Yeah, thank you, Tom. Thank you again for inviting me to talk here.
Certainly. Take care.
Take care. Bye.